Welcome to Biblical Missiology Podcast, Episode 4, The Emergence of Islam, initially recorded at the Legacy Conference in Detroit, Michigan, 2012.
Now, for those of you who think we're going to be doing debate, we're not going to be doing debate. We did that this morning. We're going to go ahead into another subject, and the reason why is because it is very timely. To understand why we're choosing this subject, the historical emergence of Islam. How did Islam really begin? What are we finding out concerning what really happened with Islam? The reason why we're bringing that to this meeting now, why we're even introducing, is because of two books that have just come out in the last 2 months. Dr. Tom Holland, In the Shade of the Sword. How many people know about that book? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. I would encourage you all to get that book. Let me tell you who Dr. Tom Holland is and why it's so important. Dr. Tom Holland is considered to be one of the two foremost historians in Britain today. Has written 3 best-selling books. Rubicon, maybe some of you have heard of it, which is the story of the fall of the Roman Empire. Millennium, which is the story of the history of the fall of the Byzantine Empire. And then Persian Fire, which is the story or the history of the fall of the Persian Empire. Now, who do you think would be best equipped to talk about the emergence of Islam? And I got to know him back in 2006. He was doing a documentary on the Apostle Paul, and in the documentary he asked if I could help out a little bit, and I went in. Of course, I'm not an expert on Paul, but I did what I could, and afterwards we went and had lunch together at a local restaurant after doing the filming. And over lunch I turned to him and I said, "You know, Tom, my expertise is not really Paul. I prefer the history. You're a historian. I prefer the history of Islam. Are you familiar and are you aware of the history of Islam?" He says, "Well, no, I've never really thought of it." I said, "Well, you should, considering the kind of work you're doing." And so in the next 2 hours, I just told him 10 problems, the historical problems of the Quran. And he took out his pen and started writing them down. Tuk, 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 tuk. Didn't think any of it. It was a good conversation. And that happened in 2006. Until 2012, February of 2012, and more like I say March of 2012, suddenly I found on the cover of the Times, the Sunday Times, which is our foremost newspaper in Britain, his book was featured, and that he was going to do a lecture at Oxford University. So I went to attend the lecture to see what he was going to say. And as I walked in, he came over to me, gave me a big bear hug, and he said, "It's because of that conversation in 2006 that I have written this book." So I feel privileged to introduce Dr. Tom Holland. In the hour that he was up there, and as he went through his material, and he just did a brief overview of what was in that book. The book is over 400 pages long. Everything he said in that hour is what I told him in 2006.
We knew that.
Now, why is it that we knew that and what's been going on? We have been discussing this and we have been arguing this material for 17 years. I did my first debate on this in 1995 at Cambridge University with Dr. Jamal Badawi. Dr. Jamal Badawi is considered at that time the world authority on the Quran, and in our debate I gave 10 historical challenges, some of which you're going to hear today. Those same historical challenges he could not find one answer for, did not even consider them to be important. Let's ask you, and you'll see today whether you think these are important challenges. And until this day, 2012, he has not answered that challenge for one very simple reason. They're not answerable. Dr. Tom Holland, though, is not a historian per se. He is a historian, but he's much more of an English literature expert. He did his doctorate at Oxford University in English literature. Therefore, he's a storyteller. And he's an amazing storyteller. And that's why when you read In the Shadow of the Sword, you're not going to be able to put the book down. It is pleasant reading. It is exciting. But everything he writes, he sources. Because what he did then, he went back to all those who I got my material from and where the revisionists are getting their material from. In fact, he went back to the revisionists. Now, who are the revisionists? That's this new school that is coming out of Europe who are Orientalists. That means people who study the Orient, but they're much more than what we would know as the Orient. The Orient back in archaic times was always the Middle East. So the study of Orientalism is really the study of the Middle East, the study of Islam. But these are the new school of Orientalists who are asking a very important question. And that is everything that we have known about Islam, everything we've known about the emergence of Islam, everything we've known about the Prophet Muhammad, everything we've known about the Quran, everything we've known about anything concerning Islam comes only from Islamic sources. Is that not correct? Has only ever come from Islamic sources. And no one's ever questioned whether or not those Islamic sources are correct until today. And that's why we're beginning to question this, for one very simple reason. Now, while that was happening, and just 2 months ago, another man named Robert Spencer, do you know that name? Also wrote another book called Did Muhammad Exist? A very provocative title. There's no way that, when you read the book, you will see. Robert Spencer is not even considering whether or not Muhammad existed or not. He just wrote that book, that title, to get your attention. He knew that a lot more people would buy it, and he would cause controversy. Robert Spencer loves controversy. So do I. And he knows how to sell a good book. But he's asking a very, very important question. We're not asking, and he's not asking, did Muhammad exist? What he's asking is the Muhammad of Islam, did he exist? Is the Muhammad of faith the same as the Muhammad of history? Now that's a much deeper question. That's a much more important question, because the same question has been asked of Jesus Christ. We've had to deal with this question since Wellhausen asked this question certainly in the 1800s. There in Tübingen, there in Germany. And remember what happened when the school in Germany asked this question. Look what happened to the church across Europe. It decimated the church when they asked some very simple historical questions concerning our Bible, concerning who Abraham was, concerning whether David ever existed, and whether or not the reference that we used, all the references we use for Jesus, are historically viable. The church has never recovered in Europe. Now the same questions finally are being asked of Islam, and should be asked of any religion, any religious text that is historical, and all religious texts are historical. Because every religious text deals with names of people that exist in history, places that exist in history, events that happen in history, using dates that are historical. And whenever you ask a historical question or even make a historical claim, it must be investigated at that level. And that's what we're going to do this afternoon. We're going to show you the material that's now coming to play. And you're going to see how great it is and just how fun it's going to be living for me for the next few years. Because now it's not just those weirdos up on Speaker's Corner who are introducing this. It is now the best and the brightest who are introducing this. Because basically what Tom Holland has done, and he did the same thing, yeah. I'm being recorded, yeah. And I'm slowing down. It has brand new batteries. You know, the last one worked fine as well. Yeah. So we're okay, yeah? The red light's on. I'm being red lighted. So, we're hoping that the same thing that happened to Islam in the early 1900s will happen to, that happened to Christianity in the early 1900s will happen to Islam. Because certainly this debate is an academic debate. I make no apologies for that. We're dealing with academic material. But you need to start with academia. You need to start with the universities. You need to start with basically the aristocracy to let it filter down then to the populace, as it did with Christianity in Europe. The same thing we're hoping will happen to Islam. And it needs to then be debated then. This material that you're going to hear today needs to be taken out and start debating. Now, we've been trying to debate it, but we haven't been getting much of a readership or a following in Christianity, and even less in Islam, because no one's considered us to be authoritative. Now, who are we, and who am I talking about? I'm talking about people like Dr. Patricia Krone, where I got a lot of my material from. Dr. Patricia Krone was my supervisor when I started this whole material back in the 1990s. Dr. Patricia Krone from Denmark reads and writes 15 languages. How many of you could read and write 15 archaic languages? Many of these languages no longer exist today. She was head of department at Cambridge University, got a death threat for writing Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987, had to move to was at Oxford University, had to move into Cambridge University because of a death threat from a Muslim there. She is now at Princeton University, head of department there, probably the best in the world in her area. Dr. Robert Hoyland was my second supervisor when I started my doctorate. He reads and writes 18 languages. Was head of department at Oxford University when I started my doctorate. He is now up in Edinburgh, and now he's moved on. But these are the individuals we're talking about. These are linguists, and what's great about them is that they're not going to the material that you and I would read. They're going back to the original documents, written in their languages. And many of them are taking those documents, those manuscripts, those inscriptions, And they're keeping them in those languages because they don't want Muslims to read this. Because they're scared to death what Muslims will say and do once they find out. And that's where we come in. Because I want Muslims to read this. And I want them to be disillusioned by it. And then I want to take that same material, so the same questions, and bring them back home. Because, see, we've answered every one of these questions. We've answered all the criticisms, the redacted criticisms against the Bible, source criticism against the Bible, historical criticism against the Bible. I debate it all the time, and I know it's easy to use. And what's great about it, the more we talk, the more we're finding. I just found something out this afternoon at lunch. I can't tell you because it's not going to come out until November. You will be glad to hear that we are now going to find, for the first time, source material for the New Testament from the 1st century. It's going to be published either November or December. That's all I can say. But this is going to just open up this whole debate. We just go from strength to strength. Now, it's because of this kind of material that we are now having to we're having to force Muslims to pay attention to what we're saying. It helps when people like Tom Holland makes it and brings it out to the popular press. It helps even better when you have someone like Robert Spencer, who already has a following, is well known, and then writes a book like he has done. I would encourage you all to read it, because he writes it for laymen, people like you and me, so that we can use it on the ground. Now let's open it up and let's go ahead and let's ask what's going on. In the 20th and 21st century, the revisionist school, this is a whole revisionist school that's within Orientalism, or Oriental studies, have a concern. And the first concern is they are concerned with the classical model. That is the orthodox classical model. Now, I see a lot of people writing again. I'm going to go very fast. So just to warn you, you probably won't be able to keep up with me, but I will give you this PowerPoint. You can have the material. I did so earlier. This PowerPoint I just made in the last 2 hours. So those who came this morning, you're going to have to get this because I only put this together while the others were speaking. I was listening to them, but I also want to make sure that you all got this material. So feel free to take this material. You can have it. You can have the PowerPoint. You can use it. You can abuse it however you want to use it. But let's go in and ask. The classical model is what they're concerned with. Their principal conclusion is that Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran itself probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 100 to 200 years. That's been revised now to around 50 to 60 years. Because when Ripon and Wansboro and Leicester said we are now coming up with some new material that's even more devastating. I'll get into that and we'll show you why. But obviously, as you can see, this had nothing to do with Muhammad. Okay? Now let's say, why is it they're coming to this conclusion? Well, everything you know about Muhammad and the emergence of Islam. Now let's just go through and real quickly and find out what you do know. What have we been told? Well, we've all been told that Muhammad was born in 570. We've all been told that in 610, when Muhammad was there in Mecca, he went up to a cave called the Hira cave, and in the Hira cave, suddenly an angel appeared to him and said, Aqra, recite. And his response was, Ma Aqra, I cannot recite. 3 times the angel Gabriel asked him that. He responded the same way 3 times. So then the angel let him go. He went back to Mecca, went back to his wife Khadija. Khadija asked him to recite the same story. He did so while he sat on one leg. Then she had him sit on the other leg, said the same thing. Then she took off all her clothes and said it a 3rd time. Why, I don't know, but as he kept to his story, proving that he was telling the truth. And then she took him to meet Waraka ibn Nawfal, who was her cousin. When he recited the story to him, it was Waraka ibn Nawfal that then said to him, truly you are a prophet. Now, Waraka ibn Nawfal was a Nestorian Christian. One of the ironies of history, it was a Nestorian Christian that gave authority to Muhammad as a prophet. And from that time on, from 610 to 622, the next 12 years, he received revelation after revelation. And that's what we call the Meccan references, the Meccan surahs, which are the latter part of the Quran. From 622, then he moved up to Medina, took with him supposedly 80 to 200 followers. This is what the Muslims tell us. This is what the traditions tell us. And then in Medina, he then set up camp there. And for the first 2 years, he had a relationship with the Jews. That relationship then deteriorated around 624 because they refused to accept him as a prophet. The Qibla, supposedly, the direction of prayer was directed towards Jerusalem at that time. He then redirected it back down to Mecca in 624. That's the canon of the Qibla. And from 624 on, then he started confronting the Jews. And he started confronting the Meccans. The Battle of Badr in 624. With 300 men, he defeated 1,000 men. He came back, confronted the Banu Qaynuqa family, and threw them out of Medina for not supporting him in that battle. A year later, when the Meccans came to revenge against that battle, you have the Battle of Uhud. He lost that battle, was wounded, almost died, came back angered by what had happened, confronted the second Jewish tribe, the Banu Nadir family, and threw them out up to Khaybar in the north. 2 years later, the Meccans came a 3rd time, and we have the great Battle of the Trench. and neither side won. He came back frustrated and blamed the last remaining Jewish tribe, the Banu Qurayza family. And there in 627, he then took all 800 men of the Jewish men, slit their throats, took the women as concubines for his men, and the children as slaves. Mecca still had not been defeated. And it wasn't until 630 that he walked into Mecca after putting together the Hudaybiyah Treaty in 628 and walked into Mecca without firing a shot. He took over Mecca, eradicated all the idols within the Kaaba, and then in 632 he suddenly died. Is that the story you know? Is there any other story? I have not given you all the story. I'm just giving you the bare bones. But that's the story we have heard. While that was happening, he was then getting revelation after revelation, and by the time he died in 632, all the revelations then were given. But it was not written down while he was alive. That was first written down by a man named Abu Bakr, the first caliph, between 632 and 634. That copy was given to one of the wives of Muhammad named Hafsa. She put it under her bed, and it stayed there for about 18 years. 18 years later, after Umar, and then Uthman was in power. Once Uthman was on power, there were a variety of Qurans that were beginning to surface. One Quran that became very well known in Damascus, authored by a man named Ibn Ka'b. Another Quran that became very popular in Baghdad, known as the Recension of Ibn Masud. Another Quran that became very popular in Basra, known as the Quran of Ibn Musa. Do you all know this? This should be common knowledge for most of you. So you have 3 different Qurans which did not agree with the uniform Quran known as the Recension of Zayd ibn Thabit. That's the Quran that we have in our hand today. Supposedly the one we have here is Zayd ibn Thabit's Recension. And this is what all Muslims say. This is the Quran that was then rewritten according to Al-Bukhari in volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510, in around 650. So 650 was then finally when the Qurans were unified under one manuscript. And that's this Quran that we have in our hands today. Have you all heard that? Certainly you should have heard that part. And then all the other manuscripts were burned. You will know that. They were all burnt then by Uthman in 650. So this book supposedly can trace its lineage back to 650. Mid-7th century, roughly 20 years after Muhammad's death. Now, would any of you want to question that? Why? And if you're going to question it, how are you going to question it? Academically.
Because, where is the validity? Where is the thing? Because you have too many hands in it.
Okay, question it on something historical. Where does everything I've told you, where does all the stories, all the history that I've just given you in the last 5 minutes, where does it come from? Where does it come from? The hadith.
It comes from the internal sources themselves.
Okay, the internal sources. And what are the names of those sources? Hadith is one of them. What else? The Sirah. Okay, the Sirah to Rasulullah, which is the biography of the Prophet. The hadith would be sayings of the Prophet. Where else does it come from? The tafsir. That's right. The tafsir would be the commentaries. And one more? The tahqiq. Thank you. The tahqiq. Those are the 4 genres of what we know as the Islamic traditions. And that's what every Muslim is dependent on to find out everything about Islam, about Muhammad, about his wives, about his children, about all the problems with the Jews, the problems with the other Ansar, and the whole Hijrah, everything that we know about the beginning of Islam, that period that happens in this part of his life, from 570 to 632, everything that we know about that period of Islam comes from the Sirah, which is the biography, comes from the Hadith, which are the sayings, comes from the Tafsir, which are the commentaries, and comes from the Tahqiq, which are the histories. Have you all heard this before? Every Muslim will know this, should know this, if they know their history. So, all that we know about this material comes from those 4 genres. Now, you would assume that those 4 genres were all written at the time of the Prophet, right? Or soon after. Because we have the very same thing in the New Testament. Because we have the Sirah of Jesus, which would be the Gospel accounts. We have the Hadith of Jesus, would be the red letter part of the Gospel accounts, red letter edition. We have the Tafsir of Jesus, would be Paul's letters. And we have the Tahqiq, which is the history of the early church in the book of Acts. So we've got the same 4 genres in the New Testament. Those are our traditions. We call them the New Testament. When were they written? Well, we know that Acts would have been written between 52 and 62 AD because of Acts 18:12. We also know that Luke, which was written by the author of Acts, Luke himself, would have written alongside of Matthew, and also Mark would have been written earlier, so they would have been written before 62 AD, possibly even before 52 AD. We know that all Paul's letters would be written within 15 to 20 years of Christ's death. We know that John would be written a little later, but certainly we could say 3 of the Gospels, the book of Acts, and all the letters of Paul would have been written within 30 to 40 years of Christ's death. Why is that important? Because they were all written while the eyewitnesses were still living, and 2 of them were eyewitnesses. So they were all still living in Jerusalem because they were not thrown out until 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. So that's why it's important that we ask the same thing of the Quran, and we ask the same thing of the traditions. Were any of the traditions, the hadith, the sirah, the tafsir, or the tariq, written within 30 to 40 years of Muhammad's death? Were there any of them written within the 7th century? Were any of them written within the 8th century? Give me one. You're shaking your head, you're not sure.
Not sure.
Can you think of any? Nope, not Bukhari. Bukhari should have been because he's the most authoritative. The earliest we have for any of these traditions is Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq died in 765, but we don't have any of his material today. We're totally dependent on Ibn Hisham for everything Ibn Ishaq wrote. Ibn Hisham died in 833. So the first reference we have for Muhammad in Islamic sources is not till 833. Muhammad died in 632. Do your maths. Can you see the problem? Now we do have some material from Al-Waqidi, but he died after Ibn Hisham, and he wrote mostly in 835, so about 2 years later. What about the hadith? Let's go to Bukhari. Bukhari is the first individual to write down any hadith. He's the first one to compile any hadith. Al-Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, which means it is perfect. Sahih Bukhari died in 870, and he wrote between 850 and 870. He was given 600,000 akhbar, 600,000 hadith. He was to look at every one of them and delineate which were authoritative and throw out anything he didn't like. And from 600,000, he brought it down to 7,397. From 600,000, he brought it down to 7,397 around this period, threw out all the rest. So in other words, he threw out 98% of it and only retained 2% of it. I'd love to know why he threw out that 98%, wouldn't you? I would love to know where it is. I would love to know where he got it from. And I would like to know why it's not around today. But nonetheless, he's the earliest to write any hadith down, and that's not to the late 9th century. Sahih Muslim comes after him. Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, they all come after Al-Bukhari. Nothing before Al-Bukhari, nothing before the late 9th century. Let's talk about the tafsir that you mentioned. Who is the earliest tafsir writer? Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari is the earliest to write any commentaries down. Same with the Tariq. The Tariq were first written by Al-Tabari as well. Al-Tabari died in 923. That's the 10th century. We have nothing before the 10th century for any of the tafsir. And that includes Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, and the list goes on and on. All the tafsir come after 923. So everything we know about Islam, everything we know about the Prophet's life, everything we know about the Quran, how it was compiled, everything we know basically about the whole emergence of Islam does not come from us, does not get written down in the 7th century, does not get written down in the 8th century, first gets written down in the 9th century. 9th and 10th century for everything that's happening in the 7th century. Does that bother any of you? That should bother all of you. And that's why the historians are asking this question, which is a perfectly legitimate historical question. Why is it the Muslims don't bother to write any of this down? Remember, Muhammad was the greatest of all prophets. He was the seal of the prophets. The Quran was the greatest of all revelations. The whole emergence of Islam, the Qibla, the Mecca, everything we know about how Islam began, none of it gets written down till 200 to 300 years after. You might say, yes, but that's because they were oral. Were they? Did they not write the Quran down? Do not all the stories refer to Zayd ibn Thabit? Who was Zayd ibn Thabit? Who was the one that wrote the Quran down? He was the secretary of Muhammad. What do secretaries do? They write, do they not? So certainly we know of not only one, we know of 4 different Qurans that had 4 different schools in 4 different cities known as the metropolitan codices, all of which have a history to them, every one of them which are referred to in the traditions. Ubay ibn Ka'b's codex, Ibn Masud's codex, Ibn Musa's codex, Zayd ibn Thabit's codex, and that's just 4 of 11 codices we now know of. We know of 11 different codices of the Quran that existed at the time of Uthman. Because of that, the historians are going back, and people like Michael Cook, Dr. Michael Cook, who also was studied under Dr. John Wansbrough that I had in the previous slide. Dr. John Wansbrough, who wrote 2 books, Quranic Studies and The Sectarian Milieu. He was head of department at School of Orient and African Studies there in the University of London, one of the probably the most progressive individuals, and asked some very simple questions. As he looked at the Quran and as he started to unlock it, as he started to look at all the stories in the Quran, and you'll see this and you'll find this, most of the stories that he found there touched on biblical themes. Many of them talked about biblical characters. Abraham, Ibrahim, Yahya, John the Baptist, Dawuda, David, Yahya, Isa, Jesus. These are people we know. These are names we know. But the problem is when you look at the stories of these people, he noticed that the stories didn't jive. So he says, hold on a minute, where did these stories come from? And when he started looking for the antecedents for these stories, he found he could source almost every one of them. But the sources for these stories would have not been in Arabia at the 7th century. In fact, though they were written in the 2nd, 3rd century, they didn't get into that part of the world until the 8th and 9th century. And he says, well, hold on a minute. How did they have access to these stories at the time of Muhammad? Could these stories have been interposed or interjected or included into the Quran at a much later date? And so he made this supposition back in 1977 and 1978. Now, he was vilified for making this supposition, and he had a death threat. He finally had to leave his practice. He went to France, took on a completely different area of study, unfortunately, because he was fearful for his own life, because of what the Muslims were going to do to him. And this is in the School of Orient and African Studies, where I studied, in the middle of London. Dr. Michael Cook was one of his students, and that's why he came up with his stories and with his material on Muhammad and also on Hagerism, which he co-wrote with Dr. Patricia Crone in the 1970s. And they did basically a what-if scenario. Now, much of that they do not own today. They have also rejected a lot of it because we've learned so much more than what they had back in the 1970s. But they said, since everything we know about Muhammad and everything we know about the Quran and Islam is not from the 7th century, is not till the 9th and 8th century, 9th and 10th century, let's go back to the 7th century and let's find out what really did happen. Let's look at the documents that are there. Let's look at the manuscripts. Let's look at the archaeological evidence. And let's ask the historical question. Now, first of all, they talked about Muhammad. What they found out is Muhammad supposedly died in 632 according to Islamic sources, yet Christians in the mid-630s still refer to him as alive, which doesn't agree with the classical 632 date. In fact, we now know that he was still alive as late as 643 according to some documents, the Dr. Ian Jacobi, for instance. The first record of Muhammad's death in 632 is not till the 8th century. It's not to the 8th century that we even find that he died in 632. Why did they know this in the 7th century? What's more, 7th century references to Muhammad are not specific, and when he is referred to, he is accompanied by a cross. Ooh, that has problems. When they look at the Qibla, we'll come back to Muhammad, but let's look at the Qibla. The Qibla is the direction of prayer. Now, according to Islamic tradition, according to the classical model, Muhammad redirected the prayer in 622 when he moved to Medina, down up to Jerusalem. And we see that in Surah 2, Ayah 145. In Surah 2, Ayah 145 in the Quran, it talks about the direction of the Qibla towards Jerusalem. He did that to ally himself with the Jews, and so hopefully by allying himself with the Jews, they would come and support him as a prophet. It didn't work. And within 2 years, he realized that he could not get the Jews on board for 4 simple reasons. And we went through the 4 simple reasons the other day. Because he was not in the prophetic line, because he didn't do anything to prove he's a prophet, because everything he said did not correspond with previous prophetic tradition, and he didn't even know who God was. Had no idea of the name of God. So for those simple 4 reasons, which would be the same reasons I would reject the prophet, he then rejected them. And so from 624 on, that Qibla would then redirect it back down to Mecca, which means any mosque anywhere at any time that's found after 624, which means every mosque, because there were no mosques before 624. Not even Medina had they have a mosque that early. So every mosque that is found should be directed towards Mecca, right? Stands to reason. Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fervardi have done probably the most germinal work, archaeological work on the earliest mosques. Before Islam made these areas no-go areas, back in the 1905, they were able to go to places like Wasit, in places like Kufa, and places like Fustat. Wasit and Kufa are in what is present-day Iraq. Fustat was outside of Cairo, in the garrison towns of Cairo, and they were able to go to the earliest mosques that exist historically. These are mosques that are dated to 660 and 680 AD, so these are all after 624. And then when they went to these mosques, they dug down to the original floor plans of these mosques, and they noticed that the qiblas of these mosques were not facing towards Mecca. The Kufa mosque and the Wasit mosque were facing west. Over here in Fustat, in Egypt, they were facing east. They should have been facing south. As late as 660 and 680. So the archaeological evidence seemed to suggest that Mecca had not yet been chosen. Yet according to the Quran in Surah 2, ayah 145 to 149, Mecca was then canonized as the Qibla in 624. So why are these mosques, which are either side of or to the north of Mecca, why are they not facing Mecca? They're facing this direction and they're facing direction. Which direction? What do you think they're facing? Looks like that. We can't say that for sure. And Tom Holland even says there's a possibility it may be even Petra. But what is interesting is they're not facing Mecca. That's the important thing. Documentation evidence seems to suggest that the same thing that we're finding archaeologically. Jacob of Edessa, writing in 705, a Christian writer, refers to the Maghreb. Now notice, he doesn't call them Muslim, even as late as 705. He calls them Maghrebs, which is the name of the area that they came from. So from all this it is clear that it is not south that the Jews in the Maghreb here in regions of Syria pray, but towards Jerusalem or the Kaaba. Ooh, that's interesting. Even mentions that Jerusalem is where the Kaaba is, that the patriarchal places of their races. So now we have documentary evidence which supports the archaeological evidence, and for hundreds of years people reading this thought that either Jacob of Edessa didn't know what he was talking about or that he made a mistake. Now we don't believe he was making a mistake. It looks like that as late as 705, the Qibla had yet to be canonized. We do know that at the time of Abdul al-Malik, who controlled under the Marwanid Caliphate, took over control of Islam from 685 to 705, and his governor in Kufa, named Al-Hajjaj, went and destroyed all the mosques in 705 and rebuilt all the mosques. Why would you destroy and rebuild mosques? Unless you're redirecting the Qibla. So it looks like, we're not saying this for sure, we have to do an awful lot more studies, it looks like that the canonization of the Qibla was not till 705. Though Muslims tell us it was 624. So, what's in Jerusalem? Well, any of you who have been to Jerusalem know what's there. The third most holy shrine in Islam. How many of you have been to the Dome of the Rock? Good. How many have you been inside the Dome of the Rock? Okay. Have you looked at have you looked at the inscriptions on the inner ambulatories there? Have any of you read those inscriptions? No? Read them next time you're there. You will find that there's a curiosity. Because what do we know about the Dome of the Rock? The Dome of the Rock was built, according to Islamic tradition, to commemorate the Miraj. The Miraj is in 624 when Muhammad woke up in the middle of the night and there was a winged horse called the Burak. He was told to get on the horse by the angel Gabriel, and so he got on the winged horse, which flew him up to Jerusalem, from Medina up to Jerusalem, and there in Jerusalem, at the rock, where the dome is now built over, down that rock he then ascended to the seven heavens. Came up to the seventh heaven, met Allah. Allah says you're to pray 50 times a day. He comes down 2 heavens, meets Moses. There when he meets Moses, Moses asks him, how many times did he ask you to pray? He says, well, 50. He says, no, that's too many. See if you can get it down. So he goes back up to the 7th heaven and sees if he gets it down. God brings it down to 45. Comes back to Moses and says, no, that's still too many. So he goes back and forth between Allah and Moses and brings it from 50 to 45 to 40 to 35 to 30 down to 5 prayers. Once he gets it to 5 prayers at that time, then Moses says, okay, that's enough. Go on back down to earth. So he heads on back down to earth, there down the rock, and then takes the Burak, the winged horse, back down to Medina. That story is known as the Miraj. Almost every Muslim should know that story. And that's why the Dome of the Rock was built, to commemorate that event. Right? Have you heard any other story? You've not even heard that one. Talk to any Muslim and ask you why the Dome of the Rock is important. Those who've been to the Dome of the Rock, is that not the story they tell you? That's why it was built. And that's why it's the 3rd most holy shrine in Islam. Take a look at it. Does it have any Qibla? There is no Qibla in the Dome of the Rock. Now that's the first curiosity. What's more, when you look at the inner ambulatories, you will see that the inscriptions, the Quranic inscriptions that are on the top. Now this is the only original part of the building. When you look at those inner ambulatories, you will see that they do not, though they are Quranic, they do not parallel the Quran that we have today. The Shahada, in fact, the earliest reference we have to Muhammad as a prophet is on the Dome of the Rock. Now the date for the Dome of the Rock is 691 AD. Muhammad died in 632. We don't find any reference to Muhammad as a universal prophet. We don't have any reference to the Shahada until the Dome of the Rock, 691. What's more, we also find that there are reference after reference on those Quranic references. They have nothing to do with the Qibla. I'm sorry, with the Miraj. There's no reference whatsoever to Muhammad going up to the 7 heavens. No reference anywhere about the Buraq, about his reference to 50 prayers or 5 prayers. None of that is on those inscriptions. All those inscriptions are anti-Christian polemics against Christ, against the Trinity. From Surah 4, Ayah 171. Say not 3. God is not one of 3, for God is one. Truly, God does not have a son. Surah 5, Ayah 116. Is it true, O Jesus and Mary, that you are to be worshipped like gods? It's a polemic against Christianity, which makes sense concerning the date and the place. This is the center of the Byzantine world. What are you going to do when you take over and destroy it? What are you going to do? Replace it. You replace that which is you are confronting. And of course, what they're confronting is Christianity, which belies and then suggests that this building had nothing to do with the Miraj. Now, I remember doing a debate back in 1998 with Abdul Green, Sheikh Abdul Green, and he laughed at me. He said, Mr. Smith, you have not done your homework. Take a look at the Dome of the Rock, and you will see here on the southern portico, right above that door, which is the southern door, which faces towards Mecca, you will see Surah 2, Ayah 145 to 149, which talks about the changing of the Qibla, proving that that is the Qibla. And you'll see up along the dome here, at the top, Surah 17, Ayah 1, which stipulates that Muhammad went from the great mosque to the farthest mosque, which a reference to that Miraj, the reference to that night journey on the winged horse. That's all it says. It doesn't say any more. You have to go to Al-Bukhari to find the whole story, proving, therefore, that this event happened. And I turned to him and I said, you know, Sheikh Abdul Green, you say, I haven't done my homework. Let me ask you, when was that outer part of the dome built? I said, how many times was the Dome of the Rock destroyed? It's been destroyed 11 times and rebuilt 11 times. What we're looking at there on the outside of the Dome of the Rock was built in 1876. It was in 1876 that they quickly put that on the southern portico, and they put that along the top so that they could have a Qibla. But you can't do that in 1876. And I said, therefore, be careful who you're accusing. When you look at the Quranic material, you will see that the Quran, even in the inner ambulatory, is not parallel to the Quran we have today. There's a reference that God is one and he has no partners. Now, who do you think that's against? And where in the Shahada today do you have he has no partners? But it is on the earliest inscriptions, proving that even that has changed since the earliest times. According to the Quran, in Surah 2, Ayah 144, Muhammad severed his relationship with the Jews around 624. Again, when they no longer considered him to be a prophet. The Doctrine Iacobi, which is in the British Museum, warns of Greek Christians about Jews who mixed with the Arabs and Saracens as late as 634 to 640. The Armenian Chronicle of 660 talks about Muhammad establishing a community which comprised both of Ishmaelites and Jews, and the breaks occurred between Jews and Arabs in 640 AD, after Jerusalem conquest, 15 years later than the Quran recorded. So according to documentary evidence, this break with the Jews, and even the fact that Muhammad continued to live, was much later than what the Islamic sources are telling us. Other references to a continued relationship with the Jews is found in Genesis Rabbah in 61:7, in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Book of Jubilees, Abu Dawud, Staluliman, and Ahmad bin Muhammad ibn Hanbal, as far as late as the late 7th century. So you see all these contradictory references that do not fit the historical record. Dr. Patricia Corona wanted to find out why this is so important of his movement up from Mecca to Medina. So she did a study on the Hijrah itself. Now remember, this woman reads and writes 15 languages. So she went back to the original text. And she found 56 references to the Hijrah, but she could not find any reference to any Hijrah, which means Exodus, from a place called Mecca to Medina. Not one reference even mentioned Mecca. She found that they all talked about Hijrah after Hijrah, that there was a whole succession of Hijrah, that sometimes people even had a whole life of Hijrah. And that almost every case, it was from the Hijaz, which is a central part of Arabia, up to the north, many times to Palestine, as if they were returning to the places of the patriarch Abraham through Ishmael. She said, this is curious. No reference to Mecca. She couldn't find any reference to Mecca in any of these documents.
Is Hijrah just...
Hijrah means Exodus.
Oh, okay.
Like a sojourner, you're correct.
Okay.
But it is a point in time for every Muslim, and it's dated to 622. Yes?
It also means immigration.
Immigration is what it means, yeah.
Okay.
Okay?
The mark of the beginning of
It's beginning of the Islamic calendar, you're right. Because it's when Muhammad moved to Medina, that's when the Islamic State began. Didn't really start till 624, really. But certainly that's when many people peg it to. Let's talk about Mecca. Now, this is probably the most devastating material. What do we know about Mecca? Well, we know it's the center of Islam, do we not? It's also the center of history. In Surah 7, Ayah 24, when Adam and Eve were up in the Garden of Eden. Now remember, according to Surah 2, Surah 7, and Surah 20, the Garden of Eden is up in space, according to the Quran. It's not on earth. Did you all know that? No. Okay, I'm teaching you something. Finally, you got something new. The Garden of Eden is up in space. So when they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, in Surah 7, Ayah 24, they're thrown down to earth. According to Al-Bukhari, where they were thrown down to is Mecca. Which means that Mecca would be the earliest settlement for all of mankind. Because I don't think there's anybody that precedes Adam and Eve in either the Bible or the Quran. What's more, according to Islamic tradition, it is Mecca where Abraham went in 1900 BC to rebuild the Kaaba with his son Ishmael. So certainly it's one of the oldest cities in history, according to Islamic tradition. It is also the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. And most Orientalists would have agreed to that. Montgomery Watt wrote a whole book on it and talked about and actually coined the term, the trade route theory. And he was the one that's talked about how Mecca got its trade. Do any of you know about the trade route theory? Any of you studied it? What do you know about it, Joe? Go ahead. What is the trade route theory?
Well, because Mecca being the center of the trade routes, as trade would transgress the Arabian Peninsula, people would naturally have to travel through Mecca so it would become the center of worship.
But more than that, all the trade that came from the east, from China, all the trade that came from India would have had to come through Mecca. Now, how do we know that? Well, Montgomery Watt helped us with that. In Surah 3, Ayah 96, the first sanctuary appointed for mankind was that at Mecca or Mecca. And Mecca is the mother of all settlements, according to Surah 6, 92, and Surah 42, Ayah 5. Now, here's the problem. Joe, help me here. All the trade is coming from India, right? Or China, over here. It has to get over to here, to the Mediterranean world, right? So you've got to take all the trade. You can't go this way because of the Hindu Kush in the Himalayas. There's a natural barrier. So we do know that all the trade had to come this way from the western coast of India, come across the sea, and it usually went up through the Persian Gulf. All right? And then from there it transgressed across the land, what is today Syria, over into the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. From there it went to the rest of the modern world at that time. All right? But we do know that in the 5th century and the 6th century, the Persians here, the Sassanid Empire, was fighting the Byzantine Empire. And for 200 years, these two great empires were fighting. Bam, 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 clashing back and forth, which shut down all the trade through the Persian Gulf. They cannot come through the Persian Gulf anymore, which means the trade needs to be redirected. So instead of coming up through the Persian Gulf, they redirected it down here across the Arabian Sea to Aden, here in the south. And from Aden, it followed this green line up through Najran, Sana, up to Taif, and then from Taif it went down to Mecca here, came back up to Yathrib, up to Yathrib here, to Khaybar, Tabuk, and then up to Gaza in the north. That's the trade route theory. That's the theory you will hear in every school. That's the theory that you'll hear every Muslim use. That's the theory I gave to my 10-year-old son. And he saw, within 30 seconds, a problem with that theory. Let's see if you're as clever as my 10-year-old son. What's the problem with that theory? Well, actually, that's the Western Plateau, so just follow the Western Plateau.
Why would they get off the boat and not go up to sea?
Give this man a hand. He's got a beard. That's why he's so clever.
He's got a beard.
That's true, and that's the problem. And when Patricia Corona looked at this, she saw it immediately. She said, why had not anybody looked at a map? If you're taking tons of good on ship, and you're bringing them across the Arabian Sea, why would you take them off here at Aden when she knew that a ton of good to go 50 miles by land would cost the same amount as 1,250 miles by sea? That's why we take everything by sea today. Everything that comes from Japan and China, all those cars, all those vehicles, they all come across, why? On ship. That's why all our oil comes on ship. Because large bodies of good, you do not want to take over land. You've got to protect them. You've got to have camels to carry them. You've got to not only pay the different territories you're going through, you've got to have food for them. Whereas with a ship, all you do is create a big vessel, put it in the water, and let the wind take it. It's the cheapest way to send any goods anywhere in the world. Knowing that, she says, why they didn't just use the Red Sea? Right here. They had a waterway going up. That was the first problem. So then she decided to see if this was true. Now, this woman reads and writes 15 languages. So she went back to all the trading documents in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. She went back to the trading documents over here in India. She went back to the trading documents over here in the Mediterranean world. She read them all in the original language, and she found the same recurrent themes coming up in all the documents. All the documents had no reference anywhere to any Arabs. There were no Arab names on any of the documents. All the names were Ethiopian. They were all coming out of Agilis, right here. Agilis was the center of the trade. Where's Agilis? Right there is Agilis. It was the Ethiopians that controlled all the trade. They were seafarers. They loved the sea. The Arabs hated the sea. They were camel herders. They loved the desert. There were no Arab names on any of the documents that she found over here. The name that came up over and over again was Agilis, 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 Agilis. It was the Ethiopians that controlled the trade, not the Arabs. This whole trade route theory was a bunch of bunk. More than that, she said, just take a look at the map. Here's the trade route. It comes up along this green line here. You can hardly see it. Najran, Sana, and here at Taif, which are all up on the plateau, it suddenly goes down to Mecca. Can you see that? Mecca is 1,000 feet from the plateau. They have to come down 1,000 feet to get to Mecca, and then go back up 1,000 feet to get to Yathrib, which is the archaic name for what is now Medina. And then from Yathrib, then they go up to Khaybar, Tabuk, up to Gaza. She said, hold on a minute. Mecca's not even on the trade route. Even it was an Arabian trade route, Mecca is about 1,000 feet off. And the reason why it's not on the trade route is because it didn't have any water. It only had one well, the Zamzam well. The only time it ever had a well and water was during the rains, which is only about 1 month a year. These other places were all on the trade route because they were oases. They all had water. They had aquifers. That's why they worked on the trade route. So she decided to look and see if anybody knew about this place called Mecca. She went to every document she could find. She went up to Ctesiphon, which is now the name for Baghdad. That's the archaic name for, the Persian name for what is now today Baghdad. She looked at all their trading documents, and she saw that they had silver mines here in Yathrib. And they came down across the deserts and opened up silver mines. They went up to Tabuk. They went up to Khaybar, and they went down to Taif. They went up and down the trade route. Not one reference anywhere to any place called Mecca. No one seemed to know about this place, Mecca. She didn't find any reference to Mecca in any documentation until 741. Muhammad died in 632. Can you see the problem? Now, I asked this back in 1995 to Jamal Badawi. Can you show me one reference to Mecca? One reference is what we're asking to. And even the reference that we see there from the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Continuato Byzantia Arabica, places Mecca somewhere between Ur and Haran, which is up in northwestern, or the western part of what is today Iraq. It's too far north. It's not anywhere near the Arabian Peninsula. Ooh, I love it. Now, till this day, I did this, and I asked this publicly in 1995 at Cambridge University. This is 2012. They have yet to answer that question. Robert Spencer is asking that question now in 2012. Tom Holland is now asking that question. Now we're going to get a lot more volume. Can you see the problem? If you don't have Mecca, you don't have the Kaaba. If you don't have the Kaaba, what are you going to do with Surah 2? What are you going to do with every reference to Mecca that's in the Quran? What are you going to do with the whole premise that Muhammad came from Mecca? What are you going to do with the whole foundations of Islam? Because everything comes crashing down. Now put yourself in their place. How are you going to find any reference to Mecca? You're going to have to learn 18 languages, at the least. You're going to have to go to every artifact that exists, which has already been pored over by the Orientalists. You're going to have to find one reference. That's all we're asking for. One reference to the greatest city in the history of mankind, to the earliest city in the history of mankind, to the city that controlled all the trade, not just north, south, east, and west, according to the Islamic traditions, but dominated the trade. You're going to look, according to Islamic tradition, there were 15 spices that were in Mecca that controlled the trade, and that's why the Mecca became rich. Dr. Patricia Kroner, in her book, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, which was published in 1987, for which she got a death threat, goes through every one of the 15 spices. She takes a chapter per spice and shows that there were not any of those spices. In fact, the only spices that existed were frankincense and myrrh, which had nothing to do with Mecca. They were only grown down here in what is called the Hadramaut area, the southern part of Arabia, and course, the Hadramat, frankincense and myrrh, they either all came from Africa or from India. None came from Arabia, and certainly not from Mecca. So in almost every category, she's been able to confront it historically, using documentary evidence, using archaeological evidence, and just common sense. What about the word name Muslim or the name Islam? We can't find any reference to any people called Muslims until 692. We can't find any reference to any religion called Islam until 691. The names that is given to these people that lived at that place were Maghratai, Hagarin, Ishmaelite, Muhajirun. These are names that would be typical because those are all antecede the 7th century. The Hagarins and the Ishmaelites are those who come in the line of Hagar and Ishmael, which most Arabs did believe at that time. And there's good documentation for Ishmaelites and Hagarins long before the 7th century. The Maghrai places them in a certain location. It's the area that they come from. And the Muhajirun are those who are, as you mentioned back there, they are the people in Exodus, or the people who are immigrants, known as the immigrants. But then there was all kinds of Hagarins and Ishmaelites who were known as immigrants. This had nothing to do with any religious connotation. Dr. Yehuda Nevo has probably done one of the greatest works on looking at the earliest inscriptions. And his book came out in 2003. Head of department at Jerusalem University. And he went through all the Arabian Peninsula and he looked at all the earliest inscriptions. The Arab inscriptions are in Syria, in the Negev deserts, down into, as far as he could go to, into the Arabian Peninsula. Of course, he couldn't get to Mecca and Medina. He wasn't permitted. But he found inscription after inscription, all of them Arabic. Many of them had the Bismillah on it, but no reference, not the Bismillah that we see in Islam. He went to all the caliphal protocols. These are the caliphs from the Sufyani period of the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty started in 661. And from the first family of the Umayyads were called the Sufyanis. And they reigned up until 685 when the Marwanids took over. And when the Marwans took over, then they introduced a whole different genre of literature. And he looked at all their protocols. That means the official documents written by these caliphs. And he couldn't find any reference to Muhammad in any of these documents. And then in 691, during the time of Abdul al-Malik, in 691, almost overnight, suddenly all the caliphal protocols refer to the Mohammedan formula. It's introduced in 691 on all the caliphal protocols that Allah is one and Muhammad is his prophet. It's also introduced on the Dome of the Rock by Abdul al-Malik. It's also introduced on the coins by Abdul al-Malik. Everything starts with Abdul al-Malik. And it all starts in 691 and 692. So now almost all the researchers are now looking towards Abdul al-Malik. What do we know about Abdul al-Malik? Well, we know he built the Dome of the Rock. We also know that he was a second of the Marwanid caliphs, and he is always known as the great Arab reformer. If you come to the British Museum, I'll show you the coins there, and you look at all the coins that start from the from 640s to 650s. You will see that there is image after image, images of the caliphs on the backs of the coins. Can caliphs have their images on any coin? Are Muslims permitted to have images? Absolutely not. That is anathema. Even Abdul al-Malik has a great coin with an image on it. Until 691, he takes the image off and replaces it with Arabic script. He is the one that eradicates all images. It looks like the problem with iconoclasm was introduced by Abdul al-Malik, redacted back to Muhammad, but had nothing to do with Muhammad. So the coins are supporting the documentary evidence, are supporting the archaeological evidence that something happened with Abdul al-Malik that created this Arab identity. And that's why all historians know this already. Abdul al-Malik is the one that created that Arab identity. But he came into power in 685. Now, let's go to the Quran itself. I'm sorry, before we do that. Okay, let's hold on. Let's don't go to Hawting and Ripon. We'll come to them later. Let's go to... Who did that? I think my sons got to my machine.
It's kind of fun.
Kids look good, isn't it? It's great to have sons who are a little more creative than I am. There you go. Let's talk about the Quran itself, because this is really where the rubber hits the road. What are we going to do with the Quran? Well, when you look at the Quran, you will see that there's lots of sources there that are rather curious. I mentioned earlier source criticism. When you look at the Quran, how many people have had a chance to read the Quran? And when you read the Quran, what about the stories about Abraham, Moses, David? Do you recognize those stories?
Sound very familiar.
Do they? Are the stories the same?
No.
Are any of the stories the same? There are some similarities. Abraham. In Surah 21, ayah 51 to 71, Abraham wakes up in the middle of the night there in Mecca. I didn't know Abraham ever went to Mecca. Did you know that? Evidently, he lived in Mecca, according to the Quran. And in the middle of the night, he goes down to the Kaaba, and he goes into the Kaaba, and he sees all the idols in the Kaaba, and he takes a large idol, and he destroys all the smaller idols. And then he goes to bed. The next morning, when they wake up, they go and accost him and ask him why he destroyed all the idols. He said, don't talk to me, talk to the great idol. Well, of course, they couldn't talk to the idol, so they take him, and they throw him in a fiery pit. Is that in your Bible? But there it is, in the Quran, in Surah 21. Where does that story come from? It sounds like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego somewhat, doesn't it? But where does that story exist? You can find the antecedent to that. It's found in the Midrash Rabbah, the Jewish folklore. Also in the Talmud of Jonathan ben Uzziah. Both of these are referenced the exact same story in the 2nd century. These are Jewish apocryphal accounts. Never considered to be authoritative. Written in the 2nd century AD, and they find their way into the Quran somewhere in the 7th and 8th century. Mount Sinai, in Surah 7, ayah 171, has a story of God lifting up the Mount Sinai and holding over the heads of the Jews. That hails from a 2nd century apocryphal Jewish account called the Abu Sarah in the 2nd century as well. Story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5, ayah 31. Cain kills his brother Abel, doesn't know what to do with the body, sees a raven scratching in the ground, so he takes his brother and buries his brother like he sees the raven doing. Now, is that story in your Bible? No, but I can tell you where it comes from. It comes from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, which is another 2nd century account written by the Jews as an apocryphal account. The very next verse, verse 32, goes on and talks about the blood of Abel and says, he who slays the blood of one, it's as if he slays the blood of all. He who saves the blood of one man, he saves the blood of all, which is a redemptive analysis. What's that doing in the Quran? Well, it should have come in the Quran for one very good reason. We know exactly where that comes from. That comes from the Bar Sanhedrin, written in the late 5th century. A scribe who was writing and copying out the story of Jonathan ben Uzziah about Cain and Abel and the raven, takes the story, writes about the blood of Abel, and then decides to, in his own penmanship, in the margins, write about the blood of Abel. And he says, if you take the blood of one, you take the blood of all. If you save the blood of one, you save the blood of all. When that was recopied in the late 5th century, in the Bar Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 5, not only is the story of Cain and Abel and the raven incorporated, but his editorial comment was then slapped in after it, proving that this is not only an editorial comment that's in a story. That story, along with the editorial comment, was then incorporated into the Quran in Surah 5, ayah 31 and 32. Ooh, we know who wrote it. We know when it was written. We know why it was written, and it did not come from God. This is straight source criticism. The same kind of material that was applied to our Bible and came up wanting. Solomon and Sheba. I love this story. This is probably one of the most enjoyable stories. I don't know if you've all read it, but it's a great story because it's not the story I heard in my Sunday school. Solomon every day would march the birds, right, left, getting them ready for battle. They would then fly up over the enemy and they would drop rocks on the enemy, and the bottom of the rock would be the name of the person they're going to kill. First Air Force ever invented. There goes Solomon. I had no idea. One day when he comes back to march his birds, he realizes one bird is missing. The hoopoe bird's missing. He gets angry because that's his favorite bird. And then he sees the bird flying from the south, lands at his feet. And he says to him, where have you been? He says, well, I've been down south in the land of Sheba, and there's a gorgeous queen down there. You've got to go see her. He says, well, you go on down and bring her back up. So it flaps on back down to Sheba, lands at the queen of Sheba, and she talks to the bird as well. I didn't know she could talk to birds, but according to the Quran, she does. Talks about this great king in the north. So she comes with her whole retinue, comes up to Jerusalem, comes in the back door of the throne room. As she's about ready to cross over to where Solomon is sitting, she looks on the floor and she sees what she thinks is water. She thinks it's a pond. It's actually a mirror. She doesn't have that kind of technology in Sheba, so she, thinking it's water, she picks up her skirt to keep them from getting wet. And that's where the story ends in verse 44 of Surah 27. Great story, isn't it? Why wasn't I told that story in Sunday school? Lovely story. The reason why is because I know where it comes from. It comes straight out of the second Targum of Esther, another 2nd century apocryphal account. Exact same story, except for the end of the second Targum of Esther. In the end of the second Targum of Esther, when she comes across, when she realizes she thinks it's water, she picks up her skirt. When she picks up her skirt, she has hairy legs. When Solomon sees the hairy legs, he cries out in surprise. Now that is not incorporated into the Quran. They've left that part out for very good reason. But laughing aside, can you see how serious this is? Can you see what we're doing? We're being able to source almost every one of these stories now to other sources. All of them written long after the Bible had already been canonized. Yeah.
Are any Jews, Talmudic Jews today, do they have any knowledge of this?
Oh, they all do. They're laughing. They're having a great fun with it.
I don't know of anybody that's written about
John Wansbrough, he's a Jew. Yeah. Put it this way, what are you going to do if you're a Jew? Would you want to write about this?
Well, that's what I want. Yeah, okay.
They've got enough grief on their plate already. And I don't ask the Jews to sit there and try to expose this. I let the authorities do so. The scholars do it. But a lot of my Jewish friends know about this, and they laugh all the time when I bring it up at Speaker's Corner, because they're very well aware of these material. When you look at Jesus, and this is what's fascinating, when you look at Jesus in the Quran, you will see there are 93 references to him. Now, when you look at the references, you will see they do not correspond with the references we have to Jesus in our New Testament, and you can see why. Almost every one of them have been borrowed from sectarian sources. John Gilchrist in South Africa is doing a book that's going to come out in this summer, where he's been able to trace almost every one of their stories back to the Nag Hammadi Gospels, which are Gnostic writings written in the 2nd and 3rd century. None of them had any view of Jesus as Lord or God, and that's why you have even the reference in 04:157 of Jesus not dying on the cross, that another took his place. That comes straight out of Basilides' writings, who was another Gnostic writer. It's all Gnostic writings. Much too late, completely inauthoritative, and in complete opposition to the gospel. That's why I will not accept the Jesus that I see in the Quran. And I said this openly, I'll say it everywhere I go, because they've got the wrong Jesus. But we have to go back and see that, to know that historically, to be able to source it. When he talks as a child in Surah 19, that comes from the first gospel of the infancy of Jesus Christ. The creating of birds in the clay in Surah 349, that comes from Thomas's gospel, the infancy of Jesus Christ. Both of them 2nd century documents. We could go on and on and on and on. Wait till John Gilchrist's book come out this summer, and you'll be able to see just how much of a fraud the Quran is.
What was the last name?
Gilchrist, Gilchrist, out of Johannesburg in South Africa. I was just with him about 2 months ago. We shared a platform together, and it was great to hear his lecture on this. Yeah.
Okay, a lot of this stuff, for people who don't know, is also documented in the early 1900s by William St. Clair Tisdale.
St. Clair Tisdale was the first to come out with this. Gilchrist has now found that it all can be traced back to one genre of literature, all coming out of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt from the Nag Hammadi Gospels. The other ones that Tisdale was talking about were later renditions of the originals. Yeah.
Have you ever read anything recently edited by Gabriel Said Reynolds? He's doing some research in Beirut right now. I got a chance to talk with him, meet with him. He comes out of Germany, and he's been doing some work published by Brill about the Syriac Christian influence also upon the Quran.
Well,
and they're finding, the entire surah of the cave.
The 7 sleepers.
Yeah, they go into the cave, they come out later.
And the dog that is there.
The dog in there. That, a Christian predating Islam and the Quran, a Christian version of that, it's a fable that's found in Syriac sermonic materials.
In fact, most of Nag Hammadi are all Syriac.
Yeah, and this was things that were preached in churches, or used as a fable, as an illustration in sermons.
Here's another thing to put under your hat.
Yeah.
All what they call the poetry in the Quran, about 30% of the Quran is poetic. And this is what Muslims say is the miracle of Muhammad, because how could someone who's illiterate write such beautiful poetry? Dr. Gunther Lulling and Dr. Luxemburg, 2 of them, independent of each other, who are Syriac experts, both of them, Syriac scholars, both German, went and looked at this material and said, we've heard it before. And they looked back at all their Syriac writings, and they found that almost every one of these poems can be found in pre-Islamic Christian hymns written in Syriac in the 5th and 6th century, taken out of those Syriac dogmas and interposed into the Quran. And every time they took it from Syriac, put it into Arabic, you find the grammatical mistakes. And that's where all the grammatical mistakes are found, because they try to interpose it with the same hymnology. But it had nothing to do with Muhammad. If you're going to give credit to who wrote it, give credit to the Christians that wrote it. Nothing's new. It's all been borrowed. Thank God. And this makes my job a lot easier.
So is that cited in any of those books that have done their research?
No, this is not. This is above and beyond that, because they're not interested in Christianity per se. They're more interested in the historical antecedents.
I understand, but the fact that it was borrowed from that ancient text and
Gunther Lulling, yes. If you read his book, he gives reference after reference after reference. Gunther Lulling, I think his name's right up there. Gunther Lulling, you can get this from afterwards.
Can I just suggest the title of that book? It's the Quran in its historical context. It's edited by Gabriel Said Reynolds.
Okay. Did you all get that?
And it's an anthology of a number of essays written by other scholars who have brought similar findings.
Yeah. What we're finding is almost everything we know about Jesus is Syriac. Almost all of it written 2nd, 3rd century, all of it with Gnostic overtones, which makes it easier for me to reject it. Now, Muslims claim that the Quran was collated perfectly. They'll say, what have my sons done? Do you hear it? Scares me. It's like there's a ghost in my computer. Collated perfectly and completely. This is what you'll hear. It has no history. Have you heard this? Yet we not only know of 4 different metropolitan codices, we know about 11 others. Dr. Arthur Jeffrey, in the 1930s, when he looked at just from within the Islamic traditions, looking at all the references to these codices, he came up with 15,000 differences between these codices, all within their traditions. So when Muslims say that it has never changed, that it is complete, and has never changed for 1,400 years, just quote their traditions right back at them. One of the most curious changes is what we find with Uthman. According to Sahih Bukhari in volume 6, 509 and 510, talks about the fact that when Uthman came into power, he had Zayd ibn Thabit take the Quran that was from Hafsa under her bed and to rewrite it along with 3 other friends, Zubair, Alas, and Harith. And the 3 of them were to rewrite it in the Qurayshi dialect, which was then done. And then that one copy was made, 4 copies were made from that one copy. One was sent to Basra, one was sent to Baghdad, one was sent to Damascus, and one was retained there in Medina. Then he took all the other remaining copies, it says there, and he burnt them. Why would you burn manuscripts of the Quran?
Something you don't want people to see.
What is it they don't want to see? Variants. Unless there were variants. Now remember, this is not vowelization like Muslims try to claim today. There were no vowelization. Vowelizations only was invented in the 8th century. The Dhamma, the Kasra, and the Fatha were only introduced in the mid to late 8th century. The diacritical marks were only introduced in the mid 8th century. So you cannot have any vowelization in the mid 7th century. Long before any vowelization occurred. This was only a consonantal text that early, showing that these were all variants, consonantal variants, which has huge damage. Now, if you just look at the Islamic traditions, you will find that some of the Quranic verses were lost, according to Ibn Dawud. Others of the Quran had disappeared, according to As-Suyuti. Some of the Quran had been forgotten, according to Sahih Muslim. Parts of the Quran had been cancelled, according to Sahih Bukhari. Some of it has been missing, according to Sahih Bukhari. The verse on Rajam, the verse on stoning. And Umar, reading it and seeing the Quran, what was written there, he says, what are we going to do? We stone, the Prophet stoned after us, yet when they read the Quran to this day, they'll see that there is no stoning. It's 100 lashes. And that's true. That's in Surah 24, Ayah 2. There is no more stoning there, proving that even Umar had this problem. Did Umar have this problem? Let's ask that question later. There are some of the verses which have been overlooked. Parts of the Quran have been changed. Others have been modified, lost, disappeared, forgotten, cancelled, missing, overlooked, changed, modified. Does this sound like a book which was collated perfectly and completely? Can you see the problems? What about the dating of the Quranic manuscripts? If the Quran was written in the 650s, then why do Arabs, Christians, and Jews not refer to it until the 8th century? If you look at the earliest debates by John of Damascus, when he's debating the Muslims in the 8th century, take a look at what he says. The Quran that he's quoting today is not the Quran that we have in our hand today. He refers to surahs that no longer exist in the Quran. Yet they did exist at the time that he was living. Where are the earliest Uthmanic recensions which Muslims constantly talk about? Oh, it just says constantly. Why was the Quran not canonized until 1925 in Egypt? Did you know that? The canon for the Quran is dated to, actually should be 1924. I'm off by 1 year. 1924. Less than 100 years ago. And the canon that they have, where is the original manuscript? Because when you look at the earliest manuscript, you need to ask, where are they? Now, this is one of them that most Muslims point to. Have any of you seen these? Have any of you seen the Topkapi manuscript? You've been there in the Topkapi Museum? Okay, they're in Istanbul. According to Muslims, this is the Uthmanic recension. This is the Quran that Uthman was reading when he died, and there's his bloodstains right here. He was killed while he was reading it, and his bloodstains are on that book. But when you look at that, take a look at it. Do you notice it's interesting? It has elongated text. Do you see that here? See the elongation? Between the kaf there, there's the kaf, see there? Between the mim and the aleph, do you see the elongation there? That elongation is a script, a specific script known as the Eastern Kufic script, or the Hijazi, the Eastern Kufic script, or is the Abbasid script. Why? Because it was introduced by the Abbasids in the mid-8th century. When you look at the Samarkand manuscript, which is the other recension that Muslims claim, there in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, it also has that same elongation. Can you see that? But take a look at, these are 4 pages from the Samarkand. Do you notice they're all different? They're written by different hands. Yet they all have that elongated script, but different penmanship, showing that they come from 4 different sources. What's interesting to us, though, is the script that is being used. Take a look at this manuscript. This is the Ma'il manuscript, the 2165, that's in the British Library, which is considered to be the 2nd oldest Quran in existence. You look, notice, this is a different script, isn't it? It's perpendicular, and it's slightly slanted to the right. That's why it's called Ma'il, because that means slanting. When you look at that Ma'il Hijazi, that's a Hijazi script. That Hijazi script, well, that's a pretty poor picture. I don't know what happened there. But that's a, boy, that's terrible. That's what happens when you go to Mac. They ruin your pictures. Take a look at this. There, as you can see, the perpendicularization. When you look at the coins, you can see that the coins show you when the script changes. Now, coins don't lie. And what's great about them, they also don't disintegrate. So you can see the evolution in the Arabic script by looking at the coins. And I'll take you to the numismatic section there in the British Museum, and you will see how from the 7th century, they changed from that perpendicular, which is so, well, you just believe me, it's on that left side. Mac doesn't want you to know. To this script. This script is introduced on the coins, and in the mid-8th century, there you can see the elongation. See the elongation there? It's introduced on the coins during the Abbasid era, which means both the Samarkand and the Topkapi are 9th century manuscripts, or at the least, at the earliest, mid-8th century manuscripts. However, when you go back and you'll see that they have also versification. If you look here, you will see a medallion. See that medallion there? See the medallion there? See the medallion there? See the medallion? Every time you see a medallion, that's a new verse. Which means when this manuscript was written, there was versification. Versification was only introduced in the Quran in the late 8th century. So how can this be a late 7th century manuscript? Now Muslims will have come back to me and says, well, this was written without the medallions there. The medallions were added at a later date. Can you see there's a gap to accommodate it? Can you see there's a gap there? Can you see there's a gap there? Can you see there's a gap there? That means they wrote this manuscript, keeping the gaps there with the intention of creating versification 100 years later. So it just doesn't fly. Proving that both the Samarkand and the Topkapi are 9th century manuscripts. And most scholars today now put them to the 9th century, which means they've got 2 centuries that they've got to find some type of manuscript evidence. And that wasn't done until 1975, when you heard about the Sana manuscripts. Have you all heard about the Sana manuscripts? 1975, they were cleaning out the Sana dome, this mosque dome, and they came across a trapdoor. They opened it up, and hundreds of manuscripts fell to the ground. When they looked at them, they could decipher most of the manuscripts except for one. One of the manuscripts they could not read because it had no vowelization, it had no diacritical marks, it had no dhamma, kasra, fatta, none of the dots above and below the line. And if you don't have the dots, it's almost impossible to read the text. If you just have one symbol like this, that bowl-shaped symbol, could be 5 different letters. If you have a dot above it, it's a na. A dot above, 2 dots is the ta. 3 dots is a tha. 1 dot below it is a ba. 2 dots is a ya. Na, ta, tha, ba, ya. Which is it? So you need the dots. And the dots were only introduced in the mid-8th century. This had no dots. So obviously they couldn't read it. And so they brought 3 Quranic scholars, Arabic scholars, considered to be the world authority in ancient archaic Arabic text. Dr. Gerard Quinn, Dr. von Oleg, and Dr. von Bothmer. They were flown down in 1981 to look at this manuscript. And they took pictures of it quickly, and then their pictures, which were put on the microfilm, were confiscated by the Yemeni government when they realized what they were finding. It wasn't until 1997 that they were finally given their manuscripts back to them, their microfilms. And I went to visit Dr. Gerard Quinn in Germany, and he opened me up to this page. Now, he'd taken those manuscripts and created a facsimile of that manuscript. When you look at this manuscript, you'll notice that that is Hijazi text. That's that earlier text. But that's dated to 705. Here we have Surah 19. At this yellow mark, it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21? Surah 20 begins over on this page. But can you see they're 2 different scripts? Even with your untrained eye, you can see that these are different, can you not? This is Hijazi. On this side is Abbasid, or Eastern Kufic. There are about 6 different families of the Eastern Kufic. This is one of the 6 families of the Eastern Kufic script, which was only introduced in the mid-8th century. So between these 2 pages, you have about 60 to 70 years. Can Can you see the problem? If this is dated to 705, and this is dated to the late 8th century, what does that say about the Quran? And this is the earliest manuscript we have been able to come across. Does it not suggest that even as late as 705, the Quran was still not complete? Which suggests that Muhammad had nothing to do with the Quran, just using manuscript evidence. Now, what's more devastating is what they're now finding today, and this is all happening in the last few months. They are now putting these under ultraviolet light, and they're finding these palimpsests. They're finding a script underneath it. Can you see here? There's some writing underneath, and there's a script here, and there's a script here. By looking with ultraviolet light, they are able to take and separate the two scripts. And they're looking at these two different scripts, and they're finding that both are Quranic, and there's 20 to 30 years between these two scripts. And when you look at them, you will see that this script does not parallel the script that's on top. And yet this upper script is 705. The lower script is possibly 670 to 680. Isn't this great? Forensic evidence is now disturbingly showing exactly that what we have been trying to suggest, and what not only Patricia Krona and Dr. Wansberg were saying in the 1970s and 1980s, what Dr. Goldziher was saying even earlier than that, and Dr. Schacht was saying in the 1950s, that looks like Muhammad had very little to do with the Quran. Looks like much of the Quran was written possibly in the late 7th century, maybe canonized, brought together fully in the early 8th century. We can't even know that yet. There's an awful lot of studies yet to do. But isn't this exciting to live at this time? Because everything we're hearing about Islam from the historical standpoint is proving that much of Islam is fraudulent. Dr. Keith Small is a good friend of mine. He's probably done one of the best work from an evangelical scholarship standpoint, doing a comparison. He did his doctorate in this area, and he found out of the 150 available manuscripts that we have from the first 300 years that we do not find Surah 85 to 114. We find it only in 3 cases in the late 8th century, and from Surah 108 to 114 does not exist until the 10th century. We do not find a complete Quran until the 10th century, anywhere in the world. And they've looked at hundreds of Qurans. Now, 10th century, Muhammad died in the 7th century. It takes them 300 years to finally have a complete Quran. And yet Muslims say the Quran has never been changed. That the Quran we have in our hand today, according to Surah 85, Ayah 22, has always existed in heaven on the eternal tablets. What Quran are they talking about? Thank God we don't have this problem with our Bible. And thank God, as we're now doing research, the same research on the Quran, as their Qurans are trying to multiply and multiply in the early centuries, our Bibles are all coming together. So ours go like this, an upside-down pyramid. All our Bibles agree. All the variants come in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. And all those variants, we know where they are. We don't burn our manuscripts. Thank God we don't. We know where every one of the variants are. And they don't change a meaning to any of the verses. Whereas the Quran goes the other way. All the earliest manuscripts disagree. They only come together, and it looks like we're saying right now, late 7th century, early 8th century is when all the manuscripts come together. Everything else is destroyed. There seems to be a concerted effort to destroy all the manuscripts to make it one unified text. But this did not happen in 650 during the time of Uthman. This happened in the early 8th century. Ooh, I love it. Now let's conclude. The Hijrah was more than likely not towards Medina, but towards Palestine or places of the north, or an ongoing till 800. The Qibla was not fixed towards Mecca until the 8th century, but to an area much further north, and possibly Jerusalem, or even possibly Petra. The Jews still retained a relationship with the Arabs until at least 640. Mecca was not only unknown as a viable city until the end of the 7th century, but was not even on the international trade route. Dome of the Rock was possibly used as a sanctuary. Muhammad was not known as God's universal prophet until the late 7th century, and his biography took 200 years to be compiled. The terms Muslim, Islam were not used until the end of the 7th century. Terms used instead are Sarasan, Hagre, Muhajirun, and Hagarim. And the 5 daily prayers, I didn't get into this, but take a look in the Quran and see if you can find 5 prayers there. Ask your Muslim friends, are there 5 prayers in the Quran? How many prayers are there in the Quran? Only 3 prayers. Yet every Muslim is to pray 5 times a day. When do we hear about 5 prayers? Who's the first to refer to 5 prayers? Al-Bukhari, who died in 870. I'm talking about it from Quranic sources, from Muslim sources. It's not till the 9th century that we hear about 5 prayers. The Fajr, the Asr, All of these prayers that Muslims do every 5 times a day, they don't even begin to appear until the 9th century. The earliest we even hear of any Quran is not until the late 7th century, though the fragments exist in the late 7th century. And the earliest Quranic fragments, writings do not coincide exactly with the current Quran we have today. So, from what we have seen here, it is obvious to me that the Islam of faith is not the same as the Islam of history. The many claims Muslims make for Islam just do not stand up to critical scrutiny. I believe these historical problems will prove to be the Achilles heels of Islam academically, which will in time filter down to the populace and will have the same effect on the mosque that the historical critique had on the church in the early 20th century.
Let us pray.
And I hope it happens before my lifetime, because I want to pass to my sons a better legacy. But can you see how this will destroy the legitimacy of Islam? Because if you can destroy the Quran, you can destroy the Prophet's example, what pillars do they have left? Islam is absolutely dependent on one man, Muhammad, and is absolutely dependent on one revelation, the Quran. This kind of evidence is destroying both. And it's not even the Christians who are doing the work. None of these people that I mentioned, Wansborough, Krona, Cook, Ripon, none of these people are Christians. But they're academics. They're linguists. They're doing the work for us. What we need to do is do what they refuse to do. They don't want to bring this down to debate. They don't want to bring this down to the populace. They don't want Muslims to hear it. I do. And that's why we need to take this down to the populist sphere and show exactly how devastating and how hopeless Islam really is. Thank God we don't have these problems. Isn't that great? Don't you feel confident? God bless you. Go into the world and preach it.